So let's talk drop downs, modals, off canvas areas, and our new drop zone powered variants of all these elements in our latest release cycle. Up until this release cycle, we've had versions of these elements which we called the content area elements. So for example, we had content area dropdown, content area modal, etc. And you could basically use these as an entry point to put any bit of content that you needed into those interactive elements. So the really cool thing about that was that you got a toggle and a drop-down area for free, and you could kind of just put anything you wanted in there and not have to worry about those interaction styles or the functionality that powers it. Now, one major drawback of these previous iterations is that they were effectively powered by a text area, which meant that the only content you could put into that drop-down or modal or off-canvas area was text content or HTML that you would then later go back in and style accordingly. Now, obviously, since we're using our family of builders and we already have a huge element library at our disposal, it'd be super cool to be able to use those elements directly within those drop-downs, modals, and off-canvas areas, right? Well, this latest release cycle has been centered entirely around just this, bringing our drop zone-powered content areas to these three different elements so that you can really just get a whole lot more mileage out of each of these variations in your designs moving forward. So if I open up my element library, you'll see here if I search for dropdown, we have a new element that's just called dropdown. And you'll see similar versions for modal right here and off canvas. So these are the three new layout versions of these elements. We call them layout versions because much like our columns or cells or the div element, they are primarily used as a container to lay out more content within the element itself. Basically, you can just think of any element that's powered by one of our drop zones as a layout element. So to kind of get us up and running quickly, I've already placed these three variations here in my live preview. You'll see we've got a drop down. And as we open that up, you can see our dotted outline here with the element icon indicating a drop zone where we can place content that we want to work with. And as I keep going down the list here, you'll see our modal element, which has a similar style. And then finally, our off-canvas element. Now, one thing to note about all of these new layout variations of these interactive elements is that they have been completely revamped from the ground up. So there's a whole new set of controls and options to work with to really get the most mileage out of all of these pieces. For example, if I go over to my drop-downs control list over here, you'll see that we have a completely revamped setup control group. With the drop-down in particular, we have full control over the width and height of our element. We have our common text align control, which again you see on all of our layout elements, be it a column or a cell or anything like that. We've got transition management of the drop-down itself, so we can specify the timing of how long it should take to come in and out of view, and also the easing curve that we want to use. We've got some functionality tweaks we can make to the element itself. So for example, with the drop-down here, we can specify whether we want this drop-down to fire on click or on hover with our toggle here. And then finally here in the setup control group, you'll see our overflow control. So we can set that to overflow hidden if we desire. If we're needing something where we want those corners to be maybe really rounded and just cut off any content inside. And then finally here, we have advanced backgrounds. So again, much like our columns or cells, if you turn on this advanced option, you'll see all sorts of options for doing hero images or videos and parallax effects, just all sorts of really cool new options to explore in these three elements here. Now, if I turn off my advanced backgrounds and go down here, you'll see that everything else for the most part looks pretty much the same. We've got the base styling controls you see on a lot of our elements, our padding, border, box shadow. The last big difference that we've made to these elements is that we've included an internal flexbox control. So when this control is enabled, the drop zone area of the individual element will now be powered using Flexbox. So we can lay out its internal content using row or column layouts. We can wrap those children or not if we want. And then of course use our horizontal and vertical alignment controls to get a lot of mileage out of how we want to position things inside each of these elements. Now for the most part, all of these other variations are pretty similar. For example, if I go to the modal here, you'll see we've got the new width and height controls, text align, transition. Now for our modal and off canvas area, there is a body scroll parameter here, which we can set to allow or disable. And basically this says when the modal is open or the off canvas area, if I've scrolled to the end of my content inside the modal, should the body element continue to scroll or not? Now this is typically set to allow by default because that's how our elements have worked up until this point, but you can click this over to disable and that will completely lock your modal or off canvas area in place on the screen. Again, you'll see our overflow control, advanced backgrounds, a slightly reorganized backdrop and close control group, where you can of course set the color for your backdrop, the size of your close button, where you want it to go, its colors, and then finally the internal flexbox layout if you want to opt into that. Finally, we have our off canvas area here, which you'll see is a little bit different. We've only got our width, minimum width, and maximum width here because the off canvas area is intended to be a full height element. So we're focusing primarily on the width controls here for our dimensions, but you'll see that once again, we've got our text align, transition, our body scroll control, overflow, and backgrounds. And then the one subtle difference here for the off canvas element is of course, the positioning of the element itself, if we want it to show up on the left or right side of the screen. Now, one really helpful addition we've made to the off canvas area is this new close offset control. So by default, the off canvas area has some internal padding that is automatically calculated for you based on the size of your close button, which you set over here. And that's because as you scroll through your content in this area, for the most part, we probably don't want that close button to be hidden by anything or just visually obscured by some content behind it. However, there are situations where you might want your content to go full width, and then you can specify the padding of your elements as you see fit. So if that is the case, you can now set this control right here to exclude, and that will turn off that internal padding, and then you can set it using any sort of nested element like a div or something like that. And then of course, finally again, we've got our brand new Flexbox layout control, which powers this entire content area in here. So we can really start to see just how much this changes the game by quickly adding some elements from our library. So for example, I've got my off-canvas element here, and let's just pretend that we wanted to make this some sort of recent post navigation that comes in from the side of the screen when a user opens it up. Well, you'll remember from our 4.0 update, our new post element prefabs were a big part of that release. So let's just add an element here. We'll search for posts. And let's just try something like post list here first. You can see that now with the click of a button, we have a very cleanly styled and nice post list in our off canvas element. And of course you can click on any one of these pieces to edit its size, its spacing, color. Everything is fully inspectable using these prefab elements. But let's try just a couple other variations here. So let me delete that. I'm going to jump back in, search for posts, and maybe we'll use the tiles variation this time. The great thing about these prefabs is they've been designed to work in all sorts of contexts. So you can see that even just throwing this fairly intricate element over into our off-canvas area here, it fits just great. We can scroll down through our content and get a sense of how that might look and feel in our design. Let's just try one more variation here. I'll delete this and we'll now do post magazine. This is kind of a combination of the tiles element and the list element that we saw earlier. So again, the really cool thing here is you can see we've just thrown in a prefab here, and out of the gate, we have a great looking little sidebar with kind of a featured post up top and then our latest posts after that. And again, since this is fully customizable, we can add any new elements we want. We could easily add a title above our featured post, for example, by maybe clicking this headline, duplicate that, drag this up to the top. Maybe we'll change this to featured. Then we'll jump down here to our margin control, give it just a little bit of spacing. So you can see that very quickly we've modified our prefab element to suit our needs here. And this is precisely what we're trying to accomplish with these brand new drop zone powered elements. We really want to bring all the power of the element library and the layout elements you already use into these interactive elements so you can really start exploring more advanced layouts and features in your designs. Now, we didn't just stop here with these drop zone powered elements. We really wanted to give you all some fun jumping off points and get your creative juices flowing. So, along with this release, we've also included 3 new Mega Menu Prefab Elements. And you can find these by opening up the Elements library here. And if I just search for Mega Menu, you'll see them show up here in your standard elements list. So if I close out the library and scroll down the page here just a bit, I've already added these elements to my page, and you can see as I click on this first toggle here that we've got our Mega Menu dropdown. Now, this internal layout with this featured section up top and these kind of 2 main links, and then this bottom section with a inline navigation, this markup is repeated throughout all of the different variations. What we're really looking to do here is just give you all a simple example of how you can take a really cool design like this and put it in a completely different context, and it totally changes the look and feel of that content. So we can see the drop-down variation here, and actually if I collapse my interface, you can see it a little bit easier. Now if I close out my drop-down and then open the modal, you'll see that we have the same content from before, our featured links up top, inline navigation down below, and then finally, we have our off-canvas mega menu. Now, this is a great example where I'm using that close offset control from before. So you can see here that we have excluded the internal padding inside this off-canvas area, and that's because we wanted these divs that contained our content within to spread out across the full width of the off-canvas area. So this is a great example of why you might want to exclude that auto padding value and then use your own in a design that you're trying to accomplish. Just running through the design here really quickly, you can see that we've got our 2 kind of main sections inside of each of our drop zone powered elements. We've got these divs just breaking things up a little bit. You'll notice we've got a common heading for each of our sections. It's just kind of giving us a sense of the content within. And then for our top section here, we're actually just using 2 button elements that we've styled to have a similar look and feel from the text side of things, and then we've just tweaked our graphics a little bit over here. In our bottom section, we're actually using a navigation inline element that we've just set up so that the links kind of wrap to new lines as they run out of space. And you could, of course, plug any navigation that you're using in your WordPress install directly into this element right here. So again, just kind of showing off some fun variations of how you might want to mix and match various elements and get a much more styled kind of high-end look rather than just a traditional navigation element that just has links in a uniformly styled list or something like that. Now, I personally have only just begun to really explore some of the possibilities of these drop zone powered elements, and I am just really enjoying the doors that it's opening up for me in all sorts of design application type ways. So, for example, if I jump over to my drop-down mega menu here, I'm just going to apply a preset that I was working on earlier. Click on this, replace my content, and kind of walk you all through what's going on here to get this particular look. So you can see from the top down here, we've just styled our toggle just a little bit differently, kind of giving it some character here. And in this scenario, I was kind of imagining sort of a contact card, if you will, that you could almost put anywhere, maybe a header or a footer, just anywhere on your site. And clicking this toggle, of course, brings up the kind of card design that we've got going on here. Now, what I did in this situation that's different from the Mega Menu prefabs you saw earlier is I'm starting from a row configuration. So we've got this main div over here, and then our secondary div over to the right here that's housing the map in this card. So let's just jump up to our drop down here and kind of run through the setup and see how we got this look. So one trick I'm doing from the get-go is I'm setting a hard pixel value for this entire dropdown. And that just gives me a rock-solid baseline that I'm working with, which I can then update all of my sizing internally from there. So you'll notice if I just bump this up to 18 or down to 14, we get a slightly different look, but it's very manageable and consistent throughout. So the first trick I'm doing here is I'm setting its width using our VW units or viewport width units. You can think of this as effectively being 66% of the entire viewport. And then beyond that, I've set a floor and a ceiling to how big and small that overall drop-down size should be as the screen size goes up and down. And you'll kind of see all of this in play here in just a moment and kind of why I set this up in this particular way. Next, I'm using the Dropdown's internal flexbox layout, but I've set it to a row orientation, and I'm making sure that my children wrap. And this is important because at some point, as my menu gets a little bit smaller, I want this map to pop down below my text content to the left so that it's responding nicely for smaller screen sizes. And then we've just set the horizontal alignment to the start here, and then we're stretching it out vertically so that we've got this content matching here. Next, I've got these two div elements as direct children of the dropdown itself. And both of these from a sizing standpoint are set up exactly the same. If I click on my flex control here, you'll see that we've got flex grow set to 1. So that just means that this div should grow if it has space to do so. The shrink value says the opposite. Basically, that this div should shrink as the dropdown itself is sizing down. And then finally, this flex basis value is where kind of the magic comes into play here. If you've watched this channel at all, you'll know that I'm a big fan of using what I like to call auto-responsive layouts, basically layouts that will size themselves intrinsically based on properties that you set up with the elements used in that layout. So what this value is effectively saying here is that each of these divs should be no shorter than 22 ems unless it absolutely has nowhere else to go. So you'll notice if I get my browser over here and just start sizing it down a little bit, at some point my divs break from being in a row orientation to this column orientation. And that's because right about here is where both of my divs are about 22 ems wide based on the font size I set earlier. So if I bring it down just a little bit more, the moment that they fall beneath that 22em floor value, they're going to break onto a new line and fill up all of that available space that's left. So that is a super cool trick to take advantage of, and it's one that I use all the time in my designs. Now, the next little auto-responsive trick that I'm using is this row element here where I'm managing my text. And again, all of this is a little bit of a give and take. I've kind of started with some faux content that I was playing around with here. And then I know the techniques I want to use with these auto-responsive layouts and things like that throughout. And then I really just start playing around with values until I get it working just the way I want in these particular setups. So here I'm using another auto-responsive layout technique that we've talked about in some previous videos as well. Effectively, instead of setting a hard column value here where maybe I do 50-50, if I input one value into my custom input here, it's being output to each of these columns as a flex basis value, which is what we were using previously on our div element. So similar to our div element, what this value is saying is these columns should be no shorter than 16.5 ems unless they absolutely have nowhere else to go. Now, since the internal space inside of this div right here is not going to allow for two columns at that value to be placed side by side, it's just automatically placing this second column here towards the bottom of the parent div. And in addition to using these auto-responsive layouts, another reason why I love using the row in this way is that I can use the row's gap controls to space out this content very uniformly. So for example, if I thought that maybe this gap was a little bit too big, I could just bring it down to 2 ems and it would bump it up slightly. Or I could just place it back to the original value there. And so what's happening here is that when we size the browser down and our divs get to that point where they start breaking into new lines, it just so happens that because of the way we've set up this row element, it now has the space to allow its columns to break side by side for this particular viewport size. And again, this is the beauty of using these auto-responsive layouts. There's no way, well, I take that back. There is a way you could manage all of this with global media queries, but it would just be a mess, and it would never be as elegant as having the browser just kind of manage all of this for you as you size things up and down. So we can see if I just bring this down a little bit more, at some point, once we hit that 16.5em value, this column is going to break into a new line. And that looks great for this particular setup. And it's just going to continue sizing down overall as I keep bringing my viewport width down. Now, at some point, you would obviously want to most likely hide this element and then style a more mobile-centric version to use on very small screens. But the really cool thing about using this approach is that you can see we're getting a ton of mileage out of this layout just by being careful with how we set things up and being thoughtful with the values that we want to use. As for the map to the right here, really we're just using our map element. I'm using the Google Maps API here. I've set a latitude and longitude that's centering my map there. I can, of course, specify my zoom levels, do anything like that. And then I've added a custom marker here. If I jump in, you'll see that we've got an image that I've uploaded just to make this look a little bit more custom. And if I jump back up to my map, we've also got a custom dark style here, which we got by going to Google's Map Style app, which you can get to simply by clicking this button here.